Neighborhood History channel, where we will be doing our live stream lecture. We are getting a little bit of a late start today, but that is because of scheduling conflicts and everything, which forced me to basically move everything around so that we could finally get a set time. I had a couple of appointments and errands to run. Last minute holiday things are always extraordinarily demanding, and so we will be going for the next hour or so talking about our live stream lecture topic of the week. This is actually a makeup session from last weekend where I was so sick with the flu that I wasn't able to actually be here, and I had to cancel the live stream lecture and basically did it and am redoing it today. I am doing a special live stream lecture tomorrow that hopefully everybody will come and check out, and that's at the normal live stream lecture time of 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Couldn't do 4 p.m. today, so we are doing 2:30, and we are really getting started at 2:45-ish on the west coast of the United States in the Pacific time zone, so 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Tomorrow we will be back at our 4 p.m. usual standard time for our lectures, where we will be discussing the history of some Christmas history, the history of Christmas celebrations and traditions that will eventually mold themselves into a video that I will be making on the history of Christmas that will come out on Christmas Eve, that I hope you all are really looking forward to. So you want to learn about the history and the practices of Christmas and some of its conventions that we do every year and why people do it every year throughout the world, particularly in the Western world. Well, then come and check out our live stream lecture tomorrow at its normal time. It's a holiday special for all of you, and I hope you enjoy the next hour or so where we do a makeup from last week, where I will be talking about the history of the Roman Republic and how the Roman Republic functioned. So for the first time ever, we are doing 4 live streams in a row: Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Usually we do 3 in a row. We started off doing live streams in the early summer where we did Saturday afternoons, Q&As, all of that great stuff, and that was a lot of fun, and people wanted to do more questions and get more answers and wanted to bring up more historical topics for the channel. So we eventually started doing Saturdays and Sundays, and that was so enjoyable. But I noticed that all the topics that I had wanted to discuss during the live stream Q&As that I never was able to do, I could never get around to them because everybody had so many great questions and everything. So I decided to create a live stream lecture that I hopefully will one day meld into the Friendly Neighborhood History podcast, and we'll get to that eventually. So it's good to see everybody. Thank you for joining. You've got my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, in the chat. He has put the social media handles there, so please be sure to follow me on X and Instagram and Facebook for some more updates. And of course, I believe the email is on the channel as well. Maybe Simon, if you could put the email in there if anyone wants to chat with me there. I am going to be making a Discord as well as a Substack during my winter break during these holidays, so that we can create a little bit more of a community that's a running community where you're getting updates from me there. So yeah, we're trying to be as interactive as we can here, Spartacus. That's what we enjoy doing, and that's what I'm going to be doing for the next hour. I'm going to be talking to you about the history of the Roman Republic and how the Roman Republic functioned, where it came from, and what happened to it. So the first republic in human history and how it functioned, coming right up on the Friendly Neighborhood History channel with our live stream lecture. If you are just joining us, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, where I talk about all things social studies, past and present, humanities, things like that. And if you want to join us for our Q&As, they are every Friday and Saturday evenings, and we had two really enjoyable ones on Friday and Saturday night this weekend. And we'll be doing another live stream lecture, a bonus holiday special, getting ready, talking about the history of Christmas tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are usually here Sundays at 4 p.m., but we got pushed back today due to scheduling issues. But yeah, consider liking and subscribing, following those social media handles. Becoming a Friendly Neighborhood Historian is as easily as liking and subscribing and all of that great stuff. So I'm going to tell you the history of the Roman Republic, and I'm going to start with early Rome, because you can't start with the Roman Republic without discussing the earliest days of Rome. And I won't be interacting with the chat as much, but it's so great to see all of you, and I see all of your comments and everything, and I really appreciate you being here. But please show some love to my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, as we go through the history of Rome and its republic, how the republic was founded, how it functioned, all of that great stuff. Been really looking forward to this one. I know a lot of people would really enjoy it, and I wish James Kirk was here, because he is the one who gave me this idea. He asked about it at the end of the Q&A, and I realized it was just too much, and I would love the fact that someone from my channel gave me such a great topic to talk about, and I realized it deserved a full hour of attention and discussion. So I hope you all enjoy that discussion about the history of the Roman Republic. So we take a sip of water and we'll get started, and we'll get on our way. Sorry, I just need to do that. Let me actually plug in my microphone so you guys can get a better audio experience. Let me see. Okay, there's my. So I've started using a microphone on the channel to make the experience more enjoyable, and hopefully you can all hear me on the mic. Let's see here. And I think it's pairing up right now. So. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me on the microphone. Hopefully you are all enjoying the better audio quality brought to you by my new microphone and all of that. So I'm glad you love history. I'm glad you're here, favorite Christian. Great to see you. Mike, great to see you. Always great to see the friendly neighborhood historians joining us. Like becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as liking and subscribing. We enjoy having you here, even if you don't like me, don't like my face. Hopefully you like the history I'm talking about here on this platform. So anyways, ancient Rome, probably the most famous of all the ancient civilizations that you will learn about, regardless of the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Indians, the Chinese. Basically, every part of the world that's here today has an ancient society attached to it that might have been called something different than what it is now. And in Europe and in Italy and in the Mediterranean, that ancient society was clearly the Romans. So the last ancient civilization, the latest ancient civilization to be founded and come to prominence was the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. So Rome was originally founded, according to legend, in 753 BC by the brothers Romulus and Remus. Obviously, this is where the early days, the primordial days of the Roman Republic, if you will, are shrouded in myth and legend, a little bit more than history. So I am going based off of the ancient historians and their legends about the Roman Republic and how it was founded and how Rome was founded as a city and an entity. Rome was a powerful city-state for many centuries before it eventually coalesced into a series of city-states that became a republic that would become the Roman Empire later on. But basically, the city of Rome itself, the city upon the seven hills, was founded in 753 BC, supposedly by the brothers Romulus and Remus. Now, did these men actually exist and were they actually leaders? Nobody knows exactly. Were they leaders of a group of different people? Nobody is quite sure. A Roman myth that was very popular at the time of the first century BC that was perpetuated in Virgil's Aeneid is that the Romans are actually the descendants of the Trojans, that Paris's descendants included that one of the men who fled Troy was a man named Aeneas, and he eventually founded the city of Rome. That is a common historical mythology that the Romans subscribed to try to legitimize the ancientness of their people and their culture. And another way they did this was through the story of Romulus and Remus. So Romulus and Remus were two brothers who were abandoned by their mother and supposedly raised by a she-wolf. And this probably gives us the most famous image in all of ancient history, a she-wolf with two young men suckling at her teats. This is very, very famous. It's one of the most famous sculptures in all of the world, and is probably, of course, completely made up. That connection to a lupine connection for Rome's founders for the Romans would show how virulent and powerful and wily and strong they were, because they saw all of these things in the common wolf. So obviously, fierce she-wolf would be the perfect type of animal to raise your fierce rulers and leaders, and it gives your civilization a sense of legitimacy, power, and fierceness. Anyways, so that's obviously a myth. And so according to the myth, when Romulus and Remus grew up, they decided to build a city together with their families and perhaps a group of their followers. And basically there was an argument that ensued, and Romulus killed Remus. That is why the city is called Rome and not the city of Rheims. We are not studying ancient Rheims. We are studying ancient Rome. Now, supposedly Romulus was the first of 7 kings who ruled over Rome for 2.5 centuries. Rome started as a monarchy in 753, and the first king of this city-state, of this very wealthy and prospective city-state full of potential, was indeed Romulus. From there came other kings and rulers who were not nearly as powerful, feared, or respected as Romulus, including the Tarquins. The Tarquins are the last 4 rulers of this city of Rome, and they were actually not Roman, but they were from another area of Latia. Latea, as it was known then, was the central region of Italy where the local people spoke the Latin language. So that was the basis of Rome. That Rome was in the middle of the Italian peninsula, and it was it was one of several different groups of people who spoke Latin. So there were the Romans, there were the Samnites, and there were the Etruscans. And the Etruscans were a much more advanced, cohesive society, and some of their rulers, known as the Tarquins, conquered the city of Rome and became their overlords, basically their tyrants. And the Romans developed a great hatred of these Tarquins, of these tyrants from the Etruscans who ruled over them and lorded it over them, and basically were brutal dictators to the Romans for a long time. Um, so, uh, but basically, the Tarquin, the several different uh, Tarquin tyrants basically dominated Rome, extracted great amounts of wealth from Rome, enslaved many of them native Roman people, and basically made them do whatever they wanted to so that the Etruscans could become more and more powerful. Eventually, a group of women called the Sabines were taken advantage of and were stolen by the last king. And a group of Romans who were furious that the Etruscans had did this overthrew their rule and destroyed and killed the king, Tarquinius. I'm trying to remember his Tarquinius Superbus, I believe. And this happened in about 509 BC. Again, much like the stories of Romulus and Remus, there's a lot of myth and legend shrouded around this, and it's not a definitive story that actually has that coalesces around reality and facts. And the earliest sources for these historical events are centuries later on, which is not uncommon in the classical or ancient world, but does cast some spurious notions around how legitimate the stories of the rape of the Sabine women actually are, and the stories of the Tarquins and the Etruscans. The Romans got a lot of their ideas and a lot of their culture from the Etruscans. The Etruscans practiced gladiatorial combat. They were polytheists, and they were known for their but they were known most of all for their tyrannical kingdom. And the Romans didn't want a tyrannical kingdom following the Etruscans. So, anyways, by 509 BC, basically the historical thing that I can tell you is that by 509 BC, the Romans had grown tired of being ruled over by the Etruscans, and so they overthrew Etruscan rule. And rather than setting up their own sort of monarch or dictatorial system, they decided, instead of having a strongman to rule over their city-states, they would have a system of government based on their highest class. Now, the highest class in Rome was a group of people called the patrician class. The patrician class was basically the upper echelon, the highest, the top of the pyramid in Roman social structure. So in many ancient societies, if you look at their pyramidic social structures, be they Egyptian or Indian or Mesopotamian or Greek, typically the priests are near the top, or the rulers. Warriors and merchants are below the priests and the rulers, and at the bottom you have the vast majority of people who are peasants, and then beneath them you have slaves. The Roman system was different in that at the top of their society, this class of people were not priests or nobles or kings or anything like that. They weren't even soldiers necessarily or generals. They were senators. They were what were called the patricians. They were wealthy landowners who held a disproportionate amount of Rome's wealth and resources. And so Rome economically depended upon these people to be able to make it economically prosperous. And so this class of people was able to shore up all of the power for themselves and create a governing body called the Senate that would be the major governing body of Rome for the next 5 centuries. So the Senate, the system that was created, is known by the acronym SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanum, the Senate and the people of Rome. Now, you have the Senate ruled by the patrician class, and basically this was the top class in Rome with all of the wealth and power, and they could vote for whatever they wanted, and they could control elections, and they could control the government for as long as they wanted. And you had to be born of senatorial rank. You could not become a senator. You could not be accepted as a senator. You had to be born of patrician status, and that meant that your family, dating back to the overthrow of the Tarquins and the Etruscans, would have to have some sort of noble blood and noble pedigree that eventually would go back for centuries, and that is how you became a senator. Basically, there was very little social mobility in ancient Rome. If you were of a patrician class, then you had all the power and you had all the wealth, and you could help and you could have a disproportionate effect on the running of the Roman government. And so the Senate was the obvious uh, top dog political body in Rome and would make most of the rules. And it was ruled over by, in almost an oligarchical system where the wealthy landowners were able to determine the political activity of the empire. And they were pretty good at actually ruling pretty effectively. They had different roles that did different things. They had a quaestor who handled taxes, or not a quaestor, praetor who handled taxes. They had the quaestor who handled roads. Um, they had many different political roles that were actually all very significant and all worked together. And the top two roles were the executive, known as the consul. And you would have two consuls so that no one could become a dictator. Basically, the entire Roman political structure was set up, especially in the Senate, so that no one could assume more power than he ought to assume. And therefore, Rome would never be ruled by under a dictatorship. So you had two consuls who would rule for 2-year terms, and they were basically the executives, and they had the ability to mobilize the army and use it to defend Rome or expand its borders. And they would do this with the approval of the Senate. So the Senate would give the consuls approval to basically fight their wars and run their government as needed. And if there was an emergency situation in which Rome was in dire straits, dictatorial power would be given to these councils, who would be able to basically run the government without the Senate for a short amount of time and use the emergency powers to save Rome. Now, the whole assumption by the different patricians, despite them owning so much land and so much of the wealth, was that they all acted in the best interests of the people of Rome. They were always moving and shaking so that Rome would become better and safer and more powerful. And they were actually extraordinarily successful at what they did. And they were extraordinarily effective at what they did. And this can be seen by the fact that Rome not only increased its land holdings in Italy over the next few centuries, but increased its land holdings all over Europe and the Mediterranean, to the point where by the end of the Republican times, the Mediterranean was what was called a Roman lake. Rome owned all the land encompassing the Mediterranean and owned France, Spain, North Africa, Greece, Italy, of course, and large swathes of the Middle East. So by the time the Roman Republic came to an end, Rome had conquered widely and created basically a land empire that was huge. And they did this through being able to conscript and draft whenever they wanted, and relying on powerful generals and strong armies to basically conquer at will and on premises, sometimes reliable and sometimes faulty, being able to expand Rome's land holdings and military and political power. So, anyways, so what else about the Roman Senate? So the Roman Senate relied on politicians who were self-sacrificial and were willing to do their best for the survival and the increasing greatness of Rome as it continued to grow in power and influence. What allowed Rome to grow in power and influence so rapidly wasn't just the self-sacrificial nature of their politicians, the effectiveness of their armies, and their ability to fight basically at will, but also their ability to assimilate other cultures and groups of people into the growing republic without basically forcing them to become Roman. The Romans were willing to change and adapt themselves and gain cultural practices and ideas from other societies and cultures that they encountered and conquered. The best example of this was the Greeks. During the 3rd century and into the 2nd century BC, the 300s, 200s, and 1st century and 100s BC, the Romans conquered the leftover remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. And in conquering Greece and Turkey, they assimilated with Greek culture, identity, ideas, religion. The Greek gods were renamed with Roman names. The Romans used Greek philosophy, architecture, engineering, and math and science to be able to learn. And not only learn, but build cities and roads and all of these things. So their infrastructure, Roman engineering relied heavily on Greek mathematics and Greek philosophical discoveries and Greek scientific discoveries. So the Roman medicine, Roman science, Roman astronomy, Roman religion, all of these things were basically found a final form, and as they conquered the Greeks, and Greek culture became particularly important to the Romans. So the Romans were very, very good at tolerating local customs and practices and embracing those local customs and practices as a way to basically um, build their society and build their cultural zeitgeist more and more. And they did this not just in Greece, but in Egypt when they eventually conquered Egypt. And their biggest rival became their biggest inspiration. The Romans built the navy because of their greatest rival, who were the Carthaginians. And they fought a series of wars called the Punic Wars. And they were called the Punic Wars because of the Roman word for Phoenicians, who were the original founders of the city of Carthage, who had sailed across the Mediterranean and set up their settlement in modern day Tunisia, coming from the land of Canaan in Israel. The Phoenicians had set up Carthage, and that had become a strong maritime empire in the Western Mediterranean that the Romans were able to defeat and destroy in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And through that, they gained control of North Africa with all of its resources, as well as Spain with its many silver and gold mines, which made the Romans incredibly wealthy. But the Romans built a navy because of their fighting against the Carthaginians, and then they used the tactics of Carthaginian generals like Hannibal against the Carthaginians by basically invading their own homeland, fomenting revolutions against the Carthaginians, and eventually destroying them. So this was all done under a republican system that was able to be very effective and rely on politicians who were self-sacrificial, but also very either ambitious enough to use their ambition and political uh, interest to make Rome greater, or were humble enough to make Rome greater on its own without pushing their own agendas onto Rome, without pushing for their own greatness. So a lack of corruption, despite the fact that you have an oligarchical system where the wealthy landowners are able to make most of the laws in the Senate, is how Rome became as formidable as it did over the centuries. This was a slow but steady process. Um, so yes. What else? What else happened? How else is the Roman government structured? Well, it goes beyond just simply the Senate. So it's Senatus Populusque Romanum. That means the Senate and the people. Populus, people. Que, when it's added to the end, means and. So Senatus, Senate, which I just described as the patrician class, who basically are ingrained and grandfathered into the system and will always be patricians and will always be senators no matter what, and no one can really break into that. And then you have the development of other types of assemblies that represent the people, Populusque. And the best example of this is the General Assembly, which is created by the other class of people. Now, what we would call the middle class or the bourgeoisie or the artisan class, the mercantile class, is often called the plebeian class in Rome. And the plebes were a group of people who were free citizens, who owned businesses, who worked in their own, who were able to make their own products, make their own goods. They were not slaves. They were not farmers necessarily. They were on the wealthier side. They were not senators, so they did not come from a senatorial background. So they did not have senatorial clout. They were not patricians. They had not helped found the republic, so they could never be in the Senate, but they could be in the assemblies. And these different assemblies, which were made up of plebeians, many of whom were called equestrians, and that's why they were known for owning horses, and that's where we get the term equestrian from, by the way. Basically, they were able to create a secondary branch of government, or a second chamber. So there was a bicameral nature to the legislative body of Rome that was copied by another republic, the American Republic, much later on. The American Republic, when James Madison set up the American system in the Constitution, has a great vision of a Senate similar to the Roman Senate, that includes older, wiser, self-sacrificial politicians who make most of the decisions for overarching um, um, the overarching nation, while the House, or the people, the assembly, makes rules based on local interests and decisions, which is how the General Assembly and the plebeians made rules. They didn't have as much clout or influences or power, but they could make rules for their localized areas and for Rome itself. And so the plebeians didn't carry as much weight or as much political prominence as the patricians, but they could make laws and make rules. And eventually, as the centuries went on, there came to be more and more interactions between the senatorial class and the patricians and the plebeians. And the connection between the plebeians and the Senate was the only means of social mobility between the two classes, and that was the tribune. The tribune was the head of the assembly who would become a representative in the Senate, representing the interests of the equestrians and the plebeian class to the patricians. Now, the patricians, if they were wise, would always be aware of the fact that the plebeians, the assembly, represented the vast majority of free citizens in Rome, whereas the senatorial class represented a minority of interests and was far more oligarchical than the plebeians. And so, because of this, a good senate would be um, would acknowledge this and would be very open to the input and the influence and the ideas and power of the tribune. And the tribune would become an extraordinarily important part of the Roman government and would usually become one of its foremost important generals. So there's there's some information there about the plebeian class and the general assemblies, and there were several different general assemblies made up of different equestrians and plebeians who would do different things and try to negotiate for different political power at different stages. But eventually the tribune became the connection of the people to the Senate, um, and that was a common way that a normal free citizen from the middle class could actually ascend to the upper classes and tell them what was going on. Now, a lot of times, people who became wealthy businessmen or landowners, despite the fact that they had achieved a great deal for Rome, even many great and mighty generals would not necessarily receive patrician class. They would remain plebeians, and everyone was very, very aware of it. They weren't patricians, they weren't senators, and they couldn't be in the Senate, despite the fact that they had achieved a lot for Rome. So many of Rome's greatest generals and leaders were not actually patricians and could not actually be part of the Senate. But some of Rome's greatest generals were indeed part of the Senate. A great example of this was the Roman consul and general Cincinnatus, who assumed dictatorial powers for himself in the 4th century and used them both times to defeat barbarians who were basically Germanic and Celtic barbarians who were attacking northern Italy and were threatening Rome's security. And he used his power to keep Rome safe, fought for Rome, and then gave up his power. And he became an influence for George Washington to fight, give up his power, and return to being a farmer. So, but by the way, you could be a farmer and own large amounts of land and be part of the Senate. You didn't have to have a white collar job necessarily. As long as you were from a family that held significantly important political power and had a connection to the original founding of the Roman Republic, as long as you were a patrician class, you could be a senator no matter what you did, but you were more often than not very wealthy. So, if I'm correct, now that I think about it, I don't know that Cincinnatus was necessarily a senator. He could have, I think he was a tribune from the plebeian class who was used by the patrician class to defend Rome, which was done many times over. Um, One of the most important families that had helped found the city of Rome were the Brutii, who will come up again later in this story. But there were several families like the Brutii who owned a huge amount of land and were able to um, influence politics one way or another. Um, so what else was going on? So as time went on, the Roman Republic became more and more bureaucratic. It became more and more overextended, and more and more people were being represented by very, very few senators who controlled everything and more oftentimes than not had their own interests at heart. And so corruption was an extreme possibility and was often seen in many cases during the course of the Roman Republic. After Rome defeated the Greeks and the Carthaginians, basically the Mediterranean was dominated by the Romans. They They had an extremely strong navy, they had an extremely strong army, and they had an amazing system of infrastructure that had been demanded for by the plebeians and uh, the general assemblies, and had been provided by the Senate. And that included the aqueduct system. That included the different crisscrossing and interconnecting road system that made mail and transportation, and of course travel, a lot easier in for Rome. And that's where we get the phrase "all roads lead to Rome." You had an extremely strong infrastructure. You had running water. You had bathing. You had public sanitation. The Romans were very conscious of class, but they were also very conscious of remaining clean and pure and things like this. You had a very advanced and structured religious system with different devotions to different gods being possible at different times. And so the Romans were very religious, very superstitious, and all of these different things, a strong infrastructure, a strong military, served to create a Rome that was growing more and more powerful and was able to extend itself more and more. And the system of roads just continued to extend and grow as Rome moved into Anatolia and Asia Minor, and into North Africa and into Greece. Um, and basically, by the middle of the second century BC, Rome was the most powerful entity in the ancient world. It was more, the Greeks had been pushed out of the way. The Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid Empire were much weaker than them. You had the rise of the Parthian Persians in the east, who would be their formidable threat that they could never quite destroy. But other than that, the Romans had significant amounts of control and power, and had already taken over most of Spain, large parts of Gaul, which is now modern day France, all of Italy, Greece, and North Africa. And they were held together by a system that had been dependent upon people who were willing to work for the common good, agree, have a general consensus on that common good, and improve both the domestic and international function and standing of Rome through whatever means necessary, often based on faulty premises. So that was very common for the Romans. And by the middle of the second century, however, that all of this power and wealth is going to lead to the beginning of political fractions, which had already existed but were becoming more and more prominent, and basically the collapse of this system is going to start in the second century. So I would say Berger is asking a great question. Do you think a lack of powerful only led to Rome's downfall? To some extent, yes, and it's going to lead to the downfall of the Republic. For almost 4 centuries now, Rome has relied on overcoming different obstacles and enemies, and growing its wealth and influence, and the coexistence of the plebeian classes with the patrician classes, all for the betterment of all of Rome's people to make things better. However, as Rome acquired more land and acquired more slaves and wealth, the normal Romans, poorer Romans, tended to struggle more and more because they didn't have access to land or resources, and so many of them were starving a lot of the time. And there emerged a camp in the Senate that was very interested, with the support of the tribunes and the different assemblies, in giving out welfare and land grants to these poor people, and that group was called the Populares. The Populares basically believed that the government needed to do more to help the people of Rome, that the Senate was powerful, and that Rome was wealthy enough to be able to provide opportunities for these people. Meanwhile, at this time, people who were conscripted into the Roman army were only landowners. The Roman army was very small because you had only landowners who could fight, free citizens, and things like that. So most of the fighters came from the plebeian class, and many of them were fighters on horseback, called the equites, based on the same root word as equestrian, by the way. The equites were the most common basic cavalry unit in all the Roman army. So, at the same time, uh, the, um, this growing group of people create what we call populism. And they were called the populares because they were fighting on behalf of the people. And they basically believed that different measures should be taken to give the people what they needed in order to survive. And that should be the goal of the Roman Senate. They clashed with a more conservative group of senators called the optimates, who did not want to intervene on the behalf of the people and wanted to keep things going the way they always had been. They were not very They were not very committed to any notion of Rome becoming different than it had been for centuries. This had worked for a long time. Who cared that there were a large number of poor people who were starving? They'll figure it out and let the assemblies take care of them. But it seemed now that the Senate, which had for a long time only been caring about the general interests of Rome on a large scale, just like Madison envisioned the U.S. Senate working, and the assemblies working on behalf of the individual people, which James Madison also believed the American House of Representatives should work the same way. That seemed no longer to be working because the poor were as poor as ever and suffering more than they ever had before. So there was a lot going on. Um, so the basically what you had was the emergence of you had the emergence of strong political factions that would continue to fight, such as the Gracchi brothers, who were populares, who were eventually killed in riots by the Optimates. One of them was killed, and everyone was forced to commit suicide. The Optimates held on to as much political power as they possibly could, while the populares did everything that they in their own power to gain more and more influence and prestige and whip the people in a frenzy. Riots were common. Government doles and welfare were created. This is where the Romans got their bread and circuses set up from, where the Romans were basically given bread and games for free from the government for centuries during the Republic and later on during the Empire, as long as they did whatever the Republic as long as they kept loyal and did not riot and cause problems. And that was how the Optimates and other senators kept the populares at bay. One populare leader named Gaius Marius made things even more difficult when he ended land requirements for the army. So those who served in the army were not anyone could serve in the army of any Roman background, and they didn't have to own land. In fact, they were given land grants for their service by their generals at the end of the fighting. So if you went and fought and you gained some land, that land would be distributed by your general to you and your co-fighters, and you had loyalty to the generals. And so generals became more and more important, and more people flocked to and became more and more loyal to them. Marius eventually was targeted by the Optimates and others, and another civil war ensued between him and a man named Sulla. And Sulla was eventually able to defeat Marius. Marius dies in disgrace, and Sulla becomes the dictator for a short matter. But him killing off all of his political enemies, the Senate turns on him and has him assassinated. And this is all, by the way, at the beginning of the first century. So 90 BC, 80 BC, you have Spartacus's revolt, which continually undermines how the Senate treats the people of Rome. It shows the corruption of the government and how gladiators and slaves are treated in the Roman Empire. It highlights those discrepancies and those problems. And eventually and by the time you get to around 60 BC, the Republic is really just holding on to its tradition of having existed for centuries in order to continue. So there's a lot going on that's really all over the place. But the next biggest challenge will be from a group of three men: Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome; Gaius Pompey, its most successful general; and Gaius Julius Caesar, who is from a powerful Roman family, or somewhat semi-powerful Roman family called the Julii, who is emerging and growing more and more powerful in his own right and proves to be a formidable general. Eventually, this triumvirate is going to break down when Crassus dies and Pompey turns on Caesar, and they have a civil war. The Senate sides with Pompey as a way to get rid of Caesar, who they see as another populare, who's just going to give the people more land, more power, more influence, and more wealth, and take away from their own political clout. And so they turn on Caesar, they side with Pompey, and Caesar is able to defeat Pompey in the civil war. Pompey flees to Egypt and is killed by the local Egyptian ruler there, who Caesar then, in anger, overthrows for Cleopatra, his own lover, who becomes the last pharaoh of Egypt. Caesar returns to Rome. He gives clemency and forgiveness to his political enemies who had wanted him killed recently. But then when he decides to make himself dictator for life, just like Sulla, the Senate is extremely upset with this. And so the Optimates strike one more time with men like Marcus Junius Brutus and another man named Cassius, and they plot together. And on the Ides of March 1544 BC, one of the most important days in world history and maybe the most important day in Roman history. They stab Caesar to death, which causes another civil war between Caesar's supporters, including his best general, Mark Antony, and his own nephew, Octavian, who fight it once again as populares, representing the people, against the Optimates senators. And the senators are chased down and defeated, and Caesar and Antony and Octavian, with the blessing of the Senate, which is now extremely weak, basically divide up the empire between themselves and another man named Lepidus. And then eventually they turn on each other. Lepidus is bought out by Octavian, who forges documents saying that Antony will make his children with his new lover, Cleopatra, his actual heirs rather than his Roman children. This and the Senate begrudgingly allows Octavian to destroy Antony in another civil war. And then by the mid-30s, basically Octavian is the most powerful man, but instead of making himself dictator, he defers to the Senate. The Senate really likes this, and eventually in 31 BC, another very important year in Roman history, they vote to allow Octavian to become the Princeps, the Pontifex Maximus, later known as Augustus, the revered one, basically the ruler of Rome, and the title they eventually settle on is Imperator or Emperor. And so many people consider 31 BC to be the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. So that's a quick. So I know I rushed the end there. That's because I'm running out of time here. But basically, that is a summary of how the Roman Republic rose, how it functioned, what it did, and how it eventually fell apart. So I hope you all enjoyed that really fast. I am. Let me see what's going on here. I hope that's a brief history. I did it in 40 minutes. I was amazed. There's more of it I could have talked about, but I'm running out of time on my own side here. Again, I was trying to make things work around my schedule today. But if you enjoyed what you heard, if you enjoyed learning about the Roman Republic and its a brief history of it, believe me, there's a lot more that I could get into. 40 minutes is nothing. Like and subscribe. This is what we do here at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel with our live stream lectures every Sunday afternoon. Spend your weekends right after starting them right with our live stream Q&As Fridays and Saturday nights. But I hope you guys really enjoyed this, and I will stay on for a few more minutes, but I will be rumbling and getting in my car. So if you have any questions you would like to ask about that, please be sure to do so. But and I hope you guys can learned a few things and have really enjoyed this. I'm going to be going off mic in a second, but yeah, stay behind if you have any comments or questions. If not, like, subscribe, show some love to my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny. Join the Friendly Neighborhood Historians. We are trying to get a legion, speaking of the Romans, 6,000 friendly, not violent, friendly neighborhood historians. And again, a legion was conspired of units of 100, led by a centurion who was an officer who would report to a Roman general, and a legion was okay. Sorry about that. We had some technical difficulties and everything, but please join us tomorrow for our Christmas one, where we'll be talking about the history and traditions of Christmas. We like to go all around and do all sorts of different history here. I really am looking forward to that live stream tomorrow, but I hope you all really enjoyed this. Make sure to show some love to Simon on your way out, and I hope you all have a really, really great day. And I just really appreciate everyone's support, like, subscribe, all of that great stuff. Really appreciate everybody. The chat was very well behaved today. I think we had a very successful live stream lecture, a lot of fun, and really enjoyed talking about the Roman Republic and its history with all of you. Simon, I thought things went great today. What do you think? I always like to get approval from Simon before I sign off. It's one of my favorite things to do. But I think everything went well, and we really enjoyed it. Yep. Yep, I really enjoyed today. I really enjoyed talking about these kinds of things. So Be sure to like, subscribe, show some love. Check out the short form and long form content. I've got tons of videos, including a series on the Roman emperors that I think you would all enjoy checking out. So please do so when you can, and I will see you all tomorrow. Our stuff on Christmas and its traditions. Really looking forward to that. Take care and have a great rest of your day, and happy holidays to you all. Bye-bye now.